Okay, so we're going to go ahead and continue with our service this morning. Today we're wrapping up our series, which is called Cultivating Sacred Space. And we're very lucky to have one of our own, Rachel Anderson, going to give us the message this morning. So let's all please give Rachel a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Good morning. This morning we're going to talk about encountering sacred space in the other and in each other. A few years ago, I sat down with a coworker to talk about something that I thought we agreed on. Halfway through our conversation, I realized we saw things very differently. His concerns and ideas were totally different from mine. And I don't remember really what we disagreed about, but I do remember how the conversation made me feel. I was surprised and confused, a little bit disoriented. Here was someone I worked well with, and suddenly everything felt different. A gap had opened up between us where I thought we stood on common ground. I'm probably not alone in this experience. Probably all of us have shared at some point a workplace, a neighborhood, a family, or a country with people who see things very different and even feel strange to us. Sometimes this feeling of being separate is long-standing, part of social patterns of conflict, power, and identity. Sometimes differences can seem to appear quite suddenly. And oftentimes, we have a hard time even understanding what's going on. When we think about differences across our whole society, research shows us, let's see if I can show you the research. Research shows us that people really don't understand each other. So if you feel that way sometime, there's some research to prove it. For example, when Republicans are asked if Democrats hold extreme views or the other way around, both sides greatly overestimate how extreme the other side is. So 55% of people believe others, usually the other party, holds extreme views. But only 30% actually do. Now, I want to hold that 30% is a lot of people, and so that's something that to kind of hold in our hearts. But this gap of thinking that we're even more divided than we are, researchers call this the perception gap, the difference between what we think others believe and what they actually believe. What I want to propose today is that in many cases, we can relate to people with whom we have deep differences, and that these encounters have even the potential to be sacred spaces. Now, before going further, I want to name that I'm offering a big category, and we're going to kind of be general and for each of us think about what it means to have a deep difference with someone or be in deep difference. It can be many things: political beliefs, health practices, differences across culture and racial backgrounds, different priorities and struggles than our own. In bringing all these types together for today, I don't mean to suggest that each kind of difference is the same, when in fact they do differ in their histories, their relationship to structural power, and the long struggle for social justice. I also want to clarify that for today, what I don't have in mind are encounters with people who are and in relationships within which difference is a source of harm, manipulation, or abuse. These kinds of situations require a different kind of care than what I'm able to discuss today. But when it comes to encountering differences, the kind of broad, deep differences that maybe each of us are thinking about, I can tell you that my first reaction is not to think of them as a sacred space. My first reaction in these differences for me is to intellectualize them. So when I had that conversation with my coworker, my mind was spinning. I had counter arguments lined up, defenses of my position. I also wanted to find a cause for the gap between us. So so I was trying to figure out what had caused his wrong thinking. So I tried to figure out, was it his approach to religion, his political formation, maybe sexism? My second reaction was to respond with deep emotion, fear, self-doubt. Maybe he didn't really respect me. Maybe the difference between us would lead to social rejection. What I've learned in that situation and others is that sometimes what God offers in these situations of difference is not the right answer or a winning argument or even relief from a difficult emotion. Instead, I felt God calling me simply into a posture, a way to be different with that person. Today I want to talk about 3 postures God calls us to when we're with people who are different than us. Postures that, for me, have shifted encounters away from intellectualizing and kind of roiling in emotion toward becoming a sacred space. These 3 postures are a posture of equality, a posture of reverence, and a posture of love. Now first, a posture of equality. There are stories about Jesus that show us the posture that he took toward people. In one story, there was a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. She couldn't find healing anywhere. So one day when Jesus was in a large crowd, she came up behind him and touched his cloak. Right away, her bleeding stopped. When Jesus figured out who had touched him, he looked through the crowd, and when he found her, he spoke directly to her. The Bible says that he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." Now let's think about how these 2 people were positioned, Jesus and the woman, before this moment. She was likely standing behind Jesus, hiding amongst the crowd. She was probably bent down low, touching the edge of his garment, all showing that she was lower in status than Jesus and perhaps many others in the crowd. But Jesus completely changes this scene. He calls her daughter. He addresses her directly, showing family closeness, not alienation. We can picture Jesus turning to face the woman as he spoke to her, not letting her stay behind and below him. Another gospel story describes a tax collector named Zacchaeus, who wants to see Jesus as he passes through his town. Now, my family and I have always identified with this story because, as you know, many know, Zacchaeus was identified as being a short man. So to see Jesus, he had to climb up into a tree, far away from the crowds. And again, Jesus seeks out this man. He says, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." When he does this, it sets off whispers among the crowd because many people see Zacchaeus as a sinner and an enemy because of his work as a tax collector for the government. Let's think again in this instance, about the physical position between Jesus and Zacchaeus. Unlike the woman with the issue of blood, Zacchaeus starts the story positioned high up in the tree. This may be a symbol of the wealth that he has gained as a tax collector. It also shows that he is separated and apart from the rest of the community. And so in this instance, Jesus calls him down from the tree, bringing Zacchaeus close to him, addressing him at ground level. Both stories end with Jesus at the same level as the other person. He's in a posture of equality. The woman with the issue of blood rises up to meet Jesus, and Zacchaeus, the wealthy tax collector, comes down to meet him. So I believe that if we are following Jesus and adopting his postures, one of the first things we might do is to get ourselves into a posture of equality with other people. This means refusing to look down on other people or to see ourselves as better and more valuable. It also means recognizing our own worth, refusing to see ourselves as lower than anyone else. Now, at age 22, I had an experience that introduced me to a specific practice of this posture of equality. Perhaps surprisingly, given how divisive political life can be, it happened in a context of social and political activism. I was living in Baltimore at the time and working with a service program connected to the Lutheran Church. I became curious about a campaign in that city that had brought together churches and unions and community organizations in an effort to raise wages for people who were working vital but often underpaid jobs, folks in janitorial services, home health aides, and many others. So I started attending meetings about this effort and learning about this living wage campaign. I noticed that these organizers were very politically smart. They'd already won a lot of increases in income for the people that they represented. It was clear that they cared, but it was also clear that they cared as much about the people, the congregations, and the community members, and this process of getting to know one another and building deep working relationships. They cared as much about that as they did about their next rally or their testimony at City Hall. As I got to know these people, I learned that they were inspired and shaped by a community organizing tradition that is rooted in part in the civil rights movement. Specifically, they looked to practices that were used in the Mississippi movement, a part of the civil rights movement led by Ella J. Baker, Robert Moses, and other members of a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, it's often called. The Mississippi movement was an effort to secure voting rights and political representation among the state's Black residents. Now, the historian Charles Payne points out that when we usually remember the civil rights movement, we think of its big events, the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, voting rights marches in places like Selma. And it's true, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. often traveled place to place, leading actions, gathering public attention with these large events that kind of lasted there a moment in time. The Mississippi movement was a little bit different. It focused on developing ordinary men and women as leaders. Its leaders were committed to reaching every part of the state, cities, rural areas, small towns. They went door to door to talk with women and men about registering to vote. After getting someone's attention and finding some common ground, they might not initially ask somebody to join a big public march. Instead, they would invite them to gather in a small group to discuss civics and history, to prepare to register to vote. From the first time I learned of this tradition, from watching organizers in Baltimore and then reading accounts of the Mississippi movement, I was really drawn and fascinated. What it was about, it seemed to me, was a practice of meeting people exactly where they were, with all of their experiences and all of their worth. It was not a movement of people who were entirely the same. In fact, differences, the very kind of differences that often give rise to separation and conflict, were very much present. Differences in class, education, race, generation. Robert Moses was a graduate student from the Northeast. Other volunteers came from historically Black colleges outside the Deep South and also in the South. By 1964, SNCC had created a program that invited both Black and white students from across the country to work alongside Mississippi volunteers in the effort to register folks to vote. There was a saying passed around among SNCC leaders to describe what it was like to meet one another in a posture of equality. That saying is right here. It goes like this. Here I am, looking at the world, at the situation we're all in, from where I stand. I've reached a certain conclusion. My conclusion is no more or less valid than yours, no more or less important. So let's all consider what you see, and from all of it, we can find the truth. In other words, when you take everyone's importance and perspective seriously, you have an opportunity to work together to understand and change an unfair system. I think this 1963 photograph captures this sense of equality. It shows 3 civil rights workers talking to local people about registering to vote. The woman on the right is likely one such resident. The man directly before her is Robert Moses, the former graduate student who became a key leader in SNCC and the civil rights movement more broadly. Notice how they are at the same level. Robert Moses leaning in, listening closely. Now, a posture of equality is one way that I think God wants us to be with one another in the face of difference. Another posture that shifts our encounters toward that of a sacred space is a posture of reverence. Jesus tells a parable about the end times that shows us this posture. In this story, Jesus describes a final judgment. I'm sure this is one many of us have heard. He says, in this kind of envisioned final justice, he kind of paints this picture. All the nations will be gathered before the king who makes the final judgment. And the king will separate into 2 groups, placing one group in the favored position at his right. And this leads the listeners, kind of the interlocutors in the story, to ask, well, what is it that makes these people special? Why are they sitting on the right? It's the ones on the right in the story who inherit the kingdom of heaven. Well, says the king, in this parable, it's how they treated, or says Jesus in this parable, it's how they treated the king. The king represents God. So the king says to those who are at his right hand, come, you will inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Now, as many folks know, if you've heard this story before, you know there's this back and forth. People are kind of confused. Well, I didn't see you, the king, being hungry or unclothed or in prison. How did this happen? The big reveal that Jesus offers is that each of those people is the king. Each of those people is God. Stepping back from this parable into its meaning, we realize that it is in specifically that encounter with another person, someone who is vulnerable, a stranger. We are encountering God. And there are many things that can be said about this encounter from a position of the service that I think God calls us to do. The many ways that we need to be present with people in our communities. But I think because it really is an encounter between, God is revealing an encounter with himself through other people, I think it teaches us to have a posture of reverence towards other people. Reverence is the posture we have towards God, and perhaps even a little bit of awe. So what does it look like when we approach other people with that reverent heart? Finally, a posture that I've felt called into in connecting with those of difference is a posture of love. And now, as I indicated before, my own tradition, I come from the Lutheran Church, so I wasn't raised in the Catholic tradition. But over the years, I've come to learn and be really grateful for teachings that come within the Catholic tradition. And I want to share specifically some of the words and the ministry of Pope Francis, who who died recently. In 2013, Catholic cardinals elected Francis to be the head of the Catholic Church. In his public ministry, Francis returned again and again to themes of human difference and separation. And he was particularly modern in his approach and what he was thinking and talking about. So you'll see in his writings a recognition of that very difference, the very polarization and misunderstanding that humans have toward one another at a social scale that I mentioned in the beginning, where we saw this graph where people are thinking that other people are very extreme. We're feeling very polarized. This is something that was very much on the mind of Pope Francis, not just as a phenomenon in the United States, but across the whole world. He came into his leadership in the Catholic Church just at the time when social media and online information have been making our divisions potentially much worse than they were before. We're constantly seeing images of the other side, distorted and kind of converted and weaponized in our social media feeds and through kind of opinion media and journalism. It's so easy to find content online, videos, podcasts, memes that claim to tell us what they think of us and what we should think of them, anyone who is different than us. It's really clear from his writings that Pope Francis was the Pope who kind of came into his leadership in the social media era was very much grappling with this state of affairs. In response, Pope Francis practiced a ministry that was practical and even physical. He didn't just preach to crowds or release encyclicals, which are kind of official documents of teaching from the church. He washed people's feet. He held children. He embraced people who were sick. And when he did preach and write, he talked about creating a culture, what he called a culture of encounter, a culture where we actually meet and connect with people. For Francis, this was a theological point, a theological experience. Not only are we meeting God, he believed, when we meet other people, following that story of the parable of the sheep and the goats. He also taught that we can't really be who God created us to be without these encounters with other people. He wrote, "Human beings are so made that they cannot live, develop, and find fulfillment except in the sincere gift of self to others. No one can experience the true beauty of life without relating to others, without having real faces to love." For Francis, it is both the human condition to experience separation from others. It is also the human condition and God's intention for people to experience transformation by drawing close to one another. We were created by God to live the fullness of life through the experience and a posture of love. Now, what does this mean practically? I'll share a little bit in my own life how this has looked. After learning about the community organizing tradition from my encounters in Baltimore, I began seeking it out in other places. I went to graduate school and there found mentors who were also community organizers and in fact had kind of learned some of the same practices from the Mississippi movement as they were passed along the chain, one person to another, and saw it as their calling to again, pass that knowledge and those practices along to others. I helped out in efforts similar to Baltimore, the Baltimore campaign in my new home of Boston. And then later I worked with friends to start a citywide interchurch faith and justice organization that connected Christians, predominantly young Christians from a whole host of different traditions, evangelical and conservative churches, Catholic, mainline, and progressive, all around a shared calling to seek God's justice in our community. We used tools and everything that we had learned from our mentors in the community organizing tradition. One of those specific practices that community organizers use is something called a relational meeting. Now, I know this might sound like, well, I have relationships and I meet with people, so like, why call it a specific thing? But there is a kind of an intention and a practice that kind of emerges from, again, the civil rights movement and on into community organizing and other settings today. And it just means really kind of taking a series of steps to be intentional in meeting with people with purpose, in asking questions about their story, in listening, and in finding ways that, even in that instance, what kind of common ground you might have. And over the years, as I've practiced some of these methods of community organizing, I've also tried to layer in the different postures that I talked about today. The posture of equality and reverence and love. So thinking first practically about this posture of equality. When I think of that conversation with a coworker who surprised me with his different positions, engaging that situation from a posture of equality would just mean recognizing that he's come to that position just as I've come to mine, through a particular series of influences and experiences that are just as important to him as my influences and experiences are to me. From a posture of equality, I might become curious about those influences and experiences and ask him how he came to his particular point of view. In the spirit of the SNCC workers, I might ask him if there's a truth that we could both come to see from our different points of view. The second is the posture of reverence. From that posture of reverence, I take a moment to remember that any encounter with another person could be an encounter with God himself. Put another way, I try to remember that that person carries the image of God within themselves. One thing about a posture of reverence is that it's pretty incompatible with a posture of control. Just as I cannot control the divine, God's presence and God's work in my life, I'm not trying to control another person or force them into my point of view. And on the flip side, I can't always predict what good and surprising thing might come out of our interaction. I've found this many times over the years, where, there's a whole range of meetings. Sometimes they're very ordinary, sometimes they're conflictual. In my work, sometimes organizing with churches, depending on the tradition, I've been mistaken for a secretary or an associate rather than the leader of the groups that I've been part of. And so all of this can cause hurt and dissension. But sometimes a spirit of possibility pops up in the course of a conversation, even when I wasn't expecting it. And a person names a calling that they've had on their heart that is really vital to the work that we're doing, or offers up a resource that can be really valuable. And sometimes I've left these meetings changed, as if God had set aside some worry in my soul or tapped a new reserve of energy. And in these cases, it can feel like something entirely new is born out of the encounter. And I can only chalk this up to something outside of my control, to the presence and action of God. Finally, there is a posture of love. And I think of this especially in those conversations where it doesn't produce some new revelation, some mutual understanding, or spark of something new. Sometimes we just continue to disagree, sometimes very seriously so. In these situations, ultimately I feel called to fall back onto a posture of love. And St. Francis's teaching about encounter, the call that God has for us is to extend love to another person, not to change them, to take a risk in that relationship, and through that be transformed and to be open to whatever it is that God has next. Now, as we close, I'm going to ask the music team to come up. As they come up, I'll be introducing us to a closing prayer practice. What I'll do is ask you to bring to mind a situation where you are encountering a person or a situation that held a lot of difference and disagreement. I'll ask you to only think of a situation where it feels safe, right? One where you do feel like you can bring it safely to mind. And I'll lead us in kind of a prayer practice that sort of, I'll try to bring into it like what it is that I think as I am kind of stepping into a new meeting, and stepping into a relational meeting, or in my work now, I kind of organize coalitions and coach coalitions. So I will kind of share how I enter those meetings, what's going through my mind, and the ways that I invite God into that space so that it can be transformed into a sacred space. Now, as you consider a time where you felt that you were in a place of disagreement or difference from someone else, first, take a breath. Breathe in God's presence. Remember that God is holding you in love and compassion. Now, as you remember God's love for you, take a minute to consider what it feels like to consider that person as equal to you and you to them. What are you curious about? What are you curious about the way that they see or act in the world? As you take another breath, take a moment to reflect on the presence of God, the possibility that God is present in your encounter with that person. Reflect on their status, like yours, as a bearer of the image of God. Finally, as you breathe in and breathe out, hold that person in love. Consider that the same love and compassion with which God holds you also holds them. Now invite God, if it is a time, to create something new in your encounter with that person, even if you don't know what that might be. After spending some time with this situation and with this person, offer the situation back to God and give thanks for God's abundant love and ability to create something new in each of us. Amen. So now we are going to enter into a time of taking communion together. I believe that communion is also a reminder to us that God breaks down barriers of difference between us. God calls everyone to the communion table, and here at Cedar Ridge, the communion table is open to all who come and worship together. At the communion table, I believe God can turn those who are strangers into those who fellowship together, and maybe even our friends. What we remember at communion is that Jesus broke bread and drank wine in a meal with his closest friends before he died. We all then together remember this action, this posture he takes towards us, and remember that he said he would never leave us. So when you are ready, please come and take a piece of gluten-free cracker and juice at the center table or here at the sides. You can eat and drink at the tables, or you can take it back to your seat, whatever feels most comfortable to you. There are other ways that you can respond to God's presence in this time. You can light a candle as a form of prayer and a symbol of light. There are candle stations at the back of the auditorium. And you can visit the prayer stations around the side of the room. All of the information about these is on the front page of the bulletin that you received when you came this morning. So I welcome you now to please come forward and take communion.